Hi, I'm Maggie, and my project is on voting rights of disabled Americans. My research question is as follows. There have been many laws and acts put into place to make voting accessible to all Americans, even those with disabilities. But does having the laws in place, specifically the Help Americans Vote Act of 2002, make substantial change for the people who these laws are supposed to benefit? This research project in basic is an exploration into how well the laws that are put into place actually protect the disabled community. So some of those laws, which are really important to talk about, the first that's probably the most famous is the ADA, which is the American with Disabilities Act of 1990, which protects people with disabilities the same way people are protected for race, gender, and class. So that means with jobs, voting, specifically for this project, voting. It covers the right to vote, but technically also the accessibility to vote. Earlier in 1965, there was the Voting Rights Act, which was also part of the civil rights movement. It allowed people to have assistance while voting and make reading and writing tests illegal. And the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act of 1984, which when passed, was supposed to require not only the ability to vote, but accessibility. And most recently, HAVA, Help Americans Vote Act, which requires every polling place to have accessible voting systems, according to the Department of Justice. HAVA has three titles. Those are that there must be a machine to allow disabled voters to vote, the polling place must be accessible, and voting standards must be uniform and non-discriminatory. And the ultimate reason for HAVA is to create an environment so that disabled voters have the same private and independent voting experience that everyone else has. And the implementation of voting machines in accessible polling places has empowered some disabled voters, with reports of them saying it feels great to be able to vote independently, they feel empowered. But there are no national standards or guidelines. And it really only discusses the visually impaired, which excludes a very large portion of the disabled community. And it does not mention absentee voting at all. And in the US, with HAVA, there have only been 12 cases brought, and not a single one of them was related to disability voting. And this is a lot based on a study done by Jillian Pine, where she only sampled from legally blind voters. But she did state that a fifth of disabled Americans were unable to vote because of barriers to get to the polling place or at the polling place itself, which is approximately 8 million people not being allowed to vote. They found that 92.2% of legally blind voters that were interviewed were assisted by someone, and a lot of the time the help came from poll workers, which those surveyed identified as an obstacle in and of itself. They cited poll workers not knowing how to set up the accessible voting machines, work them, or even start them up, and those voters would have to wait 30, almost 45 minutes sometimes for the machine to be start up. And then the machines themselves are often reported as not working well or just being plainly inefficient. And for a lot of disabled voters, the practice of absentee ballots is very useful and takes a lot of stress out of the voting process. But when it comes to absentee voting and other forms of voting, a lot of the action is put on the disabled voter themselves, and it's confusing and difficult a lot of the time. So, are voters able to mobilize their rights under HAVA, ADA, and other important federal laws to protect their rights? I think now, at the point we are in history, that things might become more accessible. But as we've seen in the last few months with voting and COVID-19, the disabled population is vulnerable, and issues with absentee voting and long lines have made voting even less accessible to our disabled Americans. One author that I used a lot, Rabia Belt, wrote, "It is difficult to applaud democratic values when up to 1/5 of the electorate has problems voting." And while I do believe that having these regulatory statutes to support disabled voters is really important. The political and social view of disabled citizens needs to change. There needs to be more change, but with the laws like Haav in place, the country is going where it needs to go, and eventually voting will be simple, private, and independent for all voters with disabilities and without. Here are my resources, and I just wanted to say that in further research on this project, the most important thing would be talking to more community members. More interviews with disabled voters is vital, and definitely extending that interview pool past just the legally blind, including people with autism, learning disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, deaf voters. It's all very important because the disabled community is very large and very diverse. And time will show how these issues may develop and change. As of right now, with the laws as they are and the application of them the way it is, there is a lot of room to improve so that more people can have access to voting. Thank you.